Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? We've seen a lot of graphics on the Formula One World feed this year relating to where drivers brake, where they put the power on, how quick they are on the exit of the corner, how much brake pedal pressure they actually apply, and then sometimes we see how much performance of the car they're using. I'm not exactly sure how that data is generated, but I guess it's kind of interesting to look at in the middle of a practice session. But the most interesting stat that's come out of all of this, in my view, and certainly it's reflected by some of the comments we have on this channel after various videos, is how Max Verstappen can be so quick if he's a relatively early braker. And when we see him in comparison with his teammate Sergio Perez, often as not always, but often as not, it's Max who's on the brakes first and not Sergio. And put that in the context of the general perception of a racing driver. Brakes ready late, gets on the power soon, great car control, brave, reflexes, balance, all those things that we imagine racing drivers to be. Well, Max is kind of putting a stone through the window of that and saying, well, that's not the way I drive. And look at the way he is braking. Now, why is that happening? I think it's because there are four key elements that add up to being a great Grand Prix driver like Max Verstappen. And they are, in no particular order, a driver who has an innate natural feel to make the corners shorter. In other words, to elongate the straight just a little bit more, turn in earlier to an apex, and then deal with everything that's happening thereafter with all the changes in dynamic weight and the understeer that may appear. That's one thing. Two, very, very supple and soft inputs from the hands and the feet, all related to feeling the car as a whole, feeling the surface of the road as a whole. Three, an innate feel again for creating the perfect platform or the best possible platform to do what he wants to do next with the car, whether it be very hard braking or whether it be change of direction and high speed or even medium speed or even the chicane ahead. And four, Max Verstappen, in my view, is not a reactionary, reflexy car control driver. He's an anticipatory driver who is managing the car and is on top of the car and on what it's going to do next. So that if I think personally, from watching Formula One for 50 years, talking to a lot of great drivers, picking their brains, annoying them most of the time, I'm sure, and working very closely with a few of them, to me, those are the four key areas that characterize a great Grand Prix driver as distinct from a good Grand Prix driver. There are plenty of very good Grand Prix drivers around. And let's face it, we're talking about 0.1% of the population, probably less, 0.01% of the population are born or have the ability to drive Grand Prix car at that level. The interesting thing there, of course, is that there are some drivers that tick 3 boxes or maybe just 2. A very good example of that. Sebastian Vettel has a great feel for short corners, but he doesn't have a great feel for creating a flat platform from which he's going to do those short corners or his change of direction. Another example, I think Lando Norris at the moment probably ticks at least 3 of those boxes. The one box that, as I said, after the Austrian Grand Prix, when we had the great aerial shots of him when he was with Lewis, the one box that is yet to be ticked for Lando is that shorter corner. His corner's still gone a little bit too long in terms of his entry. George Russell is another. I think his corners are great, his platforms are great, but probably he's a little bit too reactionary still and not letting the car, not warning the car enough. But anyway, let's not talk about those drivers. Let's talk about Max Verstappen and what this means for him. I think having said those 4 boxes, that doesn't necessarily mean robotically that then you've got your cloned Grand Prix driver. Every human being, of course, is different, and every great Grand Prix driver is different, just as Max Verstappen is very different from Charles Leclerc, who also ticks 4 boxes, and Lewis Hamilton, who also ticks 4 boxes. They're at different stages of their career, they've got different experience levels, and of course all human beings have different levels of emotional intelligence and psychological intelligence. So let's get down then to the crux of the matter. Why does Max, nonetheless, if he has all these abilities, brake earlier than Sergio Perez, generally speaking? I think Max is braking at exactly the right moment for any given lap on any given corner because he's feeling the car around him. He knows the platform that he wants to create, and to create that platform, this is where he's going to get maximum retardation and be able to come out of the brake pedal pressure at exactly the right rate to get the nose of the car to do exactly what he wants it to do as he's loading it up with the steering. That's a bit of a mouthful to say, but that's what's going through his mind. He's not thinking that, he's just feeling that moment. Whereas Sergio Perez typically will be thinking, how late can I brake without locking up the fronts, and then when I've got the car stopped, then I'll get it into the corner, and then I'll wait till I can get the power on, and I'll get the power on in my usual brilliant way of just looking after the rear, the loaded rear, which he does incredibly well. And I think that applies for most racing drivers. It's stop the car as late as you possibly can, get it into the corner, and then try to get to the moment where you can get on the power as soon as possible. Max Verstappen isn't thinking that. Max Verstappen is thinking, here is the next corner, this is what I want to achieve. Sorry, he's not thinking it, he's feeling it. It's going through his nerve endings. Here is the corner coming up. I need to create the platform I need. I've got the change of direction ahead of me. I need to get a little bit flat car in the middle of that change of directions. I'll come out of the brake pedal pressure here. This is where I need to brake just to come out of it. Oh no, I've got a little bit more understeer. The track grip's obviously changed from the previous lap. I'll stay on the brake pedal pressure. That's it, just nurse the front. And he's doing all that differently every corner, every lap. So there's another point, of course, to recognize is that in getting this digital readout of who is braking where, we should take into account that's just one snapshot of one part of one lap. And to give you an indication of what I mean by that, and I hope neither party will mind if I tell this story, but Rob Wilson, who's a very good friend of mine, but also an incredibly articulate, intelligent analysis of the art of Grand Prix driving, has done several days with Adrian Newey over the years, partly because Adrian is a very fast racing driver and wants to be a better racing driver, and partly because I think Adrian is and was and still will be always interested in the dynamics of driving a car and what it takes. And there was one moment when Rob was explaining, in his opinion, to Adrian that one of the key elements of driving well is to minimize the downside of the moment of rotation of the car, which is the moment that no car wants to go through. It wants to travel in a straight line, but at some moment it's got to get around the corner, and at some moment you've got to apply the lock you need to get around the corner, to put it very bluntly. And Rob was saying, the great drivers always are looking to minimize the downside of that rotation moment. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's very easy to put the steering in, have the back end come out, put a bit of opposite lock on, get the power on, and be unbelievably slow on exit. To get it absolutely right, very, very difficult. And Adrian took that point on board. And then a couple of weeks later said, yeah, and I was watching Kimi Räikkönen at Indianapolis. It was when Kimi was really quick in the McLaren. And he said, yeah, he was doing that. I could see that he was just feeling the moment when it was turn one, when it was exactly right to load up the steering. But he said, what shocked me though was that he was very inconsistent, because the next lap he was doing it, he turned it in a slightly different place, and the lap after that it was slightly different. And Rob said, well, that is it. That is the art. He's feeling every lap. The fuel load is a little bit lighter, that the temperature of the track surface has probably gone up a couple of degrees, that the brake temperatures have probably gone up a little bit as well. Tire tread temperature has probably changed. He's feeling all those things all the time, and he's constantly compensating from all the variables that are changing. And that's what makes a great Grand Prix driver. And that's what Max Verstappen does. He's feeling constantly. He's giving himself a platform, created, if you like, by his early braking, which allows him to feel everything else that's going to be affecting the car from here on in, given that he needs his shorter corner and he needs that little flat area if he's got a change of direction ahead of him. It was quite interesting, I thought, speaking of change of direction, to hear Jenson Button talking over the weekend about how impressive he thought Max's change of direction was. I think he was probably referring to Beckett's high-speed change of direction, of course, and how Max was changing direction quicker, faster than anybody else. And he kind of left it at that, saying, it was just amazing to watch. But if you try to think about why that would be, it isn't for any reason other than Max is able innately to create, for a trillisecond, a tiny flat area between the left and the right when he's getting the car stable to then put in the next input. Probably not that drastic either, it's more like that. His steering input, that is. And that is something that digital technology cannot in any way measure, and it's not something obviously that the human eye can see either. But it is something that Max Verstappen does innately. And in Max's case, we're seeing a driver who has this incredible blend of, if you like, physical experience from karting, from his dad, the way he was brought up, very, very competitive, incredibly good race driver in terms of positioning the car, placing the car. We'll talk about cops at some other time. Well, we've kind of talked about cops already. But generally speaking, I think Max does a really, really good job in that area. Very good in defense as well. And at the same time, he has this innate ability to feel the car and to anticipate what is happening. Now, all of that is a great thing, obviously. And so next time you see Max Verstappen braking earlier than Sergio Perez, do not expect, even if the engineer gets on the radio to Max to say, Max, you're braking earlier, don't expect to get much response, because he's doing it right. He's doing actually what the car needs to do that corner perfectly. And if somebody's braking later, probably, even though they're hitting the brake pedal later, they're not going to get as much efficiency out of the brakes as Max Verstappen is. That's how good he will be, even compared with the Sergio Perez under braking. A good analogy between what Max Verstappen does in a Formula One car and what, say, Carlos Sainz does in a Formula One car, or let's say Sergio Perez, can be seen in juggling versus reflexes. Juggling is what Max Verstappen is doing basically when he's driving a Grand Prix car. He's looking straight ahead, he's looking at all the variables in play, and he's perfectly balancing with perfect harmony the balls in the air and the balls he's catching, and it's working perfectly. But look what happens if Max looks sideways or is distracted or does something with an arm movement that isn't as it should be. He drops the ball. And that's the equivalent of an engineer saying to Max, brake a little bit later into turn 9 or something like that. It's putting him out of sync with what is working perfectly. I always think it's quite interesting, just talking about the juggling thing or thinking about the juggling thing, it's always quite interesting to see on the grid Pierre Gasly doing the reflex testing with his physio just before he gets in the car. The physio holds 2 tennis balls and either drops them both or one, and Pierre doesn't know what's going to happen. And Pierre always does a perfect job. But what he's working on there, of course, are his reactions. And as I've said right at the start of this video, the great Grand Prix drivers are not reactionary drivers. They are anticipatory drivers. And that is why Jackie Stewart always said before he got in the car, he wanted to be calm, devoid of emotion, and almost half asleep. And the reason he wanted to be like that was because that was the best way for his body to feel the car in its entirety and everything that was going around him, and to react accordingly. He didn't want to be in a reflexy, jumpy mode, because then an input might be too violent into the car. Interesting point. And I wonder whether Pierre thinks about that, and whether, well, I'd like to see Pierre juggling. That's what I'd really like to see on the grid. I think it'd be a brilliant thing if he suddenly changed it to that. He probably won't. And the other question to ask, of course, is what would happen if he's doing that reflex test and he actually drops one and gets one wrong? Will he still get in the race car? I've got a lot of time for Pierre, and as I say, I think he ticks probably 2 to 3 of the boxes of being a great Grand Prix driver. A little bit of work to do, but it sounds condescending of me to say that, but so I'm not going to go down that path any further. But I think he's pretty near it. I just think he's a bit too reactionary, as shown by those reflex tests and his desire to want to do them on the grid. Anyway, I'm getting away from Max and what makes him as good as he is. I think ultimately, because Max ticks those 4 boxes and because he is in control of what the car is doing at any given moment, give or take the odd shunt he has with another driver, because of that, he obviously then has more mental capacity to think about other things going on in the race and in his life and to handle them. So Max has much less need, regardless of his situation, of, say, a sports psychologist than a driver who's operating at the absolute maximum all the time, driving on reflexes, right on the edge of his survival instinct, who is going to be thinking, oh, I feel terrible after this race. I need someone to give me motivation to get into the car and do the next one. And you see that snowballing. You see drivers who aren't 4-box tickers having a bad weekend, and the way they resolve that is to go to the gym on Monday morning and do even more workouts than before, as if that's going to change the way they drive the race car. And that's what makes a Max as cool and as good as he is, because he's got everything under control as a driver, because he knows when to brake, as distinct from constantly trying to brake super late. He has this capacity to handle everything else.